There we go. So we are just going to dive into Mark's presentation today and use the majority of the call for going through programmatic interventions for Module 4. We have been hearing lots from everybody, but I think at this point you kind of know that we're listening and we're making adjustments along the way. One of the adjustments that we're making is just giving more time for Mark to go through the module. After that, we'll actually have you throughout the presentation take a couple of minutes after each of the major concepts just to digest what you're hearing, write down some of the questions you have about each of those concepts, and then at the end of his presentation, we'll just have a full group discussion Q&A session where you can bring forward some of those questions. If we don't get through them all, we also have an optional 30-minute period at the end of the call. We can address whatever remaining questions we have during that time, but we really want to use this time to focus on Module 4. Hopefully you were able to take a look at that before coming today, so you have an idea of what kinds of questions you have about the activities and about the theory that you can ask other peers as well as Mark. So with that, why don't we get started? Mark, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Tamarack team, and hi, everyone. Nice to connect again. It's a pleasure to be here for our 4th module in the series, Programmatic Interventions, and our our ideas that we're building on the workshops that preceded this one, Foundations of Measurement, Shifting Awareness and Culture, Nudging Systems and Policy, and we have yet to do both population level change and impact on poverty, and we'll talk about that shortly. We know that the big question in this series, again, is how do we measure our local impact in reducing poverty for communication purposes? We want to revisit this again and again and again to remind ourselves of our scope. We're trying to tackle this issue for the relatively simple, though not straightforward, purpose of communicating progress to our colleagues, knowing that if we're able to do that, that sets us up for even more sophisticated pieces of work like learning about how to make bigger impact and eventually making strategic choices about whether or not our strategy and our interventions are the right ones. But we are focusing, again, in the series simply on being able to track enough to be able to communicate progress. Today's focus is really on niche initiatives or programmatic initiatives, as other people call them, and that we're going to talk about what do those look like as outcomes, knowing that when we talk about impact on poverty, we are going to talk about that in the next module around population level change. So we're not talking today about how our niche innovations reduce poverty. And as Natasha and I and the team were working on this, we actually backed and forth quite a bit. We wanted to talk about, well, how do we know that this program or project reduces poverty? And it's an important topic, but we wanted to we eventually decided to leave that into the final, the 5th module, because we can talk about poverty reduction at a programmatic level, at a systems level, and at a population level as well. So today we're not going to talk about impact on poverty. We're going to talk about how programmatic initiatives generate outcomes that contribute to poverty reduction. And just as we do this, I did hear sound in the background, Natasha, just in case you wanted to manage the sound off for everyone. So programmatic interventions, aka niche innovations, why are they important to track? Well, we made the case that building awareness and nudging systems is important, and I don't think we have to make much of a case that program services and concrete practices are important, because those are the ones that generate relatively immediate and tangible benefits for people experiencing or at risk of experiencing poverty. Whether it's getting better access to transportation through a terrific pilot project, or improving financial assets, or better linking to jobs, we want systems that provide these tangible, concrete supports that allow people to live a better life. So this, in many ways, is ground zero for understanding poverty reduction. When we were getting ready to organize this, there was lots of ways to slice and dice this, and I actually made the final editorial call on this because there were other ways of doing this, but we decided to organize it around challenges. So when people say, we've got programmatic interventions, and how do we know what kind of outcomes are generating that contribute to impact, we thought whoever you are, you're gonna have to deal with at least these 4 challenges. And we're going to explore each of those challenges and talk a little bit about how they can be managed. So the first one is the line of sight challenge. The second one is the measurement challenge. The third one is the capacity challenge. The fourth one is the scaling challenge. The first 3 of these are really about zooming in on programmatic interventions and understanding immediate benefits for people. The last one, the scaling challenge, acknowledges that there's often programmatic initiatives that we eventually want to scale, and they introduce new dimensions of outcomes that we want to talk about. So let's go through each of those in detail, and thanks again to the Tamarack team for putting this in workbook format. And the first thing you'll have found in your workbook, as well as the presentation, is this idea of the line of sight challenge. So here's the challenge, the essence of the challenge. There are literally just dozens and dozens of programmatic initiatives within the network of activities that any one of you as local roundtables are working on. There are so many different activities, and they differ in such crazy ways about how they contribute to poverty reduction, all the way from, I remember one initiative simply trying to have a one-pass income testing event in a city, so someone didn't have to prove that they were income eligible for different subsidized services every time they used a service, a very minor thing, but important to other people, to all the way to living guaranteed basic income project. So the range is really crazy. And knowing that we will talk about how tough it is to understand how to frame and define poverty reduction, we do have the challenge of getting a line of sight. For every programmatic initiative, how do we develop a line of sight from whatever modest to dramatic outcomes generated by that project and the eventual poverty reduction? And the response for this is one that most of you are probably fairly familiar with, and it is to use a logic model or a theory of change to demonstrate how relatively short-term or intermediate outcomes eventually make a contribution to poverty reduction outcomes. Now, let's go over this, the basics again. And by the way, we could have spent 2 hours on doing revisiting basic logic models and theory of change stuff, and we chose not to because we think most of you probably have done this enough that you understand it, number one, so this would just be a refresher. Number two, for those of you that haven't, there's such good resources out there that we didn't want to use all our time in a webinar to explain them, but let's go through a refresher. Here's a basic logic model. A logic model asks people to break down a programmatic initiative, and it's mostly programmatic initiatives, between resources, activities, and outputs, activities, which is really the planned work, and the intended results, which are framed as outputs, accomplishments generated by the activities, usually phrased as numbers, 30 workshops of this, 400 people affected by that, 30 brochures produced, by such and such a time. The outcomes for people, if we, what do we achieve? What has changed because of these outputs? And finally, how does it contribute to some kind of longer term impact? And of course, in our case, that impact would be poverty reduction. So this is the very basic idea, and this works for really primitive things, really straightforward linear things, and we're going to complexify this a little bit, but I think most of you get the general understanding of this. This can provide at least a very basic line of sight to impact. This we've added a little bit here. I want to emphasize this outcome bubble. Immediate changes generated by the initiative that contribute to poverty reduction. And again, this could be improved income, reduced costs, greater access to services, any kind of outcome that contributes to impact. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the example given stuff in parentheses, that when one is describing outcome, there's different qualities of outcomes we could talk about. The type of outcome, i.e. reduced costs. The depth of impact. Oh, I reduced cost by $200 a year or $1,000 a year. The durability of the outcome. Oh, this was a one-time cost reduction of $200, or this is an annual cost reduction of $200. The coverage, how many people are affected, and possibly even ripple effects. So again, if you go into logic model and theory of change stuff, this stuff is much more elaborated about, but this today, the outcome thing, is really what we want to focus on. So how do we create a line of sight for that? Well, this is where theory of change might be useful to many of you. And what a theory of change does, and it's different from a logic model, is a theory of change actually talks about how one result should lead to the next result should lead to the next result. And then you'll see that a logic model kind of does that because it talks about outcome and impact. But in fact, when you really get into your programmatic initiatives, sometimes this thing that we just called an outcome here, the fourth or the fifth bubble here, actually has lots of little outcomes within it, that we need lots of outcomes to lead to the big impact. And a theory of change actually does that for you. In fact, if you look at your left-hand side, they talk about intermediate outcomes or preconditions for long-term change. We could call that impact. And often that causal chain is quite long. I'm also going to point you out to the value of using a theory of change. A theory of change might say this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to that, i.e. that's our line of sight. But it also allows you to say there are certain places in this causal chain where we actually want an intervention. Sometimes we don't need an intervention, but we need an intervention to make some of these outcomes happen. So you'll see this example on the right-hand side, there's intervention for the indicator on the side, right on the top right, and the other interventions are more ballistic in nature. If we do this, we'll set off a chain reaction for these other outcomes. Logic models allow you to say a lot more about here are all the outcomes we want to see to generate impact, and by the way, here are the 2 or 3 places that we're intervening to make an impact. And by the way, everyone, those little blue stars that are called intervention, each of those deserves its own logic model. Part of the reason that people often struggle with logic models on complex initiatives is because there's actually multiple outcomes being generated with multiple interventions, and one simple logic model can't handle them all. At least a theory of change allows you to be much more multidimensional. I'm going to give you a quick example of this even further. This is Niagara Prosperity Initiative, one of the 2 groups focusing on poverty reduction in Niagara region. This is very, very simple. I'm not trying to impress you here with anything sophisticated. And the City Council invested nearly $3 million in 71 neighborhood-based projects in 2015 and 2016. They've got their own working definition of poverty. You'll see that on the right-hand side. And they actually use the Sustainable Livelihood Framework as a impact framework for understanding poverty reduction. But you could easily see they zoom out at 30,000 feet and they could start tracking numbers of dollars invested into thematic areas, and they can have number of people affected and number of people affected by asset area. Now, when they talk about impact, we're going to get into this more in the next module, creating a line of sight to impact. What they actually do is look across those projects and ask to what degree using testimonials have people have seen improvements in different asset areas. And their asset areas we'll talk about later are personal assets, physical assets, social, human, and financial assets. That's a very simple way of doing it. Some of you might say, well, heck, I want much more granular detail than that. Well, this is affected by how much capacity they have to go deep on so many different projects. There's 71 here, and they don't run them. And we're going to come back to that shortly. But this reinforces the point that in order to get a line of sight to the impact, we have to talk a little bit more about outcomes. And in this case, the outcomes are very, very, very simple, or at least the measurements are. Here is the cash crunch loans example, which from the payday lending example, we've been returning to time and time again. I want to confirm it's not the only case study in the world, but we do want to have one that we return to regularly so we can build up some consistency here. And here are the kinds of things they looked at. They looked at outputs and they had activities and inputs as well. Number of loans out, average size of loan, the repayment rates. But the outcomes that they were really interested in are reduced borrowing costs, the average amount of saving because of using cash crunch loans, which was developed by financial institutions to compete with payday lenders. To what extent does it improve a credit record, and to what degree does it increase someone's financial management capability? And you'll see that those are outcomes, and we'll see if this works. Oh, there we go. Look how nice that is, everyone. This is a 51-year-old man getting pleased with himself that he can do this. There was a contribution to the financial asset impact of people's experience with poverty. And why is it using sustainable livelihood? We'll see in the next module that people choose different impact frameworks. So in this case, their outcomes contributed to improvements in financial assets, which is one part of the poverty reduction impact that they could track. Now, here's something a little bit more complex, and I said, originally said, hopefully it doesn't become this complex. I actually don't mind. I really like this example, and it's one of those in the resource kit that you have. What it says is, here's a fairly, if you really are interested in something to get granular feedback on something, and this might be more than you need for communication, you can actually go to this level. Look at all those little boxes, those little octagons, I guess, octagons. Each one of those is an outcome, and you'll see that there's sort of this results chain dimension to it. One outcome creates the conditions for the next outcome, which creates the conditions for the next one. Now take a look at the letters and the numbers. The letters refer to, here are key assumptions that we could actually test, that if we do this, we will see this. So look at the top left. Assumption C is survivors of abusive relationships, if they go through this program, will attain coping skills that will contribute to long-term employment and a living wage. There's assumptions that survivors will have enough marketable skills, and you could actually be very explicit about, here's what we think is going to happen in order to create the conditions for that impact. And you'll also see what I really like. Look at the numbers of interventions there. How many are there? 14? 14 interventions in all. Each one of those is a little logic model, by the way. And I'm not saying you have to do that, but it does show you that this program requires a lot of interventions in order to get long-term employment at a livable wage for domestic violence survivors. This is a more complex project, or one, when you get close to it, you see the granularity of what it takes, what kind of line of sight you need to create an impact. So some of the questions here are, to what extent are you using logic models or theories of change or anything else to get a line of sight between whatever you're going to frame as impact and the range of small scale outcomes that your programmatic initiatives generate to contribute to that impact? And what kinds of things might you do as a local roundtable to work with partners to create that line of sight? I think we're going to pause here for a second because that's a big idea. And Natasha, we're trying something new here, so why don't you curate the next couple of moments for us?
Yeah, okay, so everybody just we'll give you a little over a minute to just sit with everything that Mark has just told you. We're going to break this down a little bit instead of asking you to share all of your questions all at once after you've gone through the full module. This is the first challenge. So reflect a little bit on what your questions are about that line of sight challenge. Do you have questions about logic models or theory of change, or how we've proposed that you guys apply them to measuring your programmatic outcomes, moving from activities to outcomes and eventually impact? Just going to take a minute right now, write down any questions, and again, we'll bring them up after the presentation at the end. I'll also use this time as a reminder. Please mute your line if you're not speaking at the moment. There's a little bit of background noise. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, Mark, why don't we move on to the next challenge?
Great, thanks, Natasha. So here's the next challenge, the measurement challenge, one that we talked about in our very first module, and really what we're going to do now is just revisit some of those themes. We're not going to introduce much new here, but we're going to look at the measurement challenge in the context of programmatic outcomes. And we know the challenges we have to measure. We'd like to measure some kind of progress for those, but each of those requires, each program you have has its own unique indicators and methods. So it's very difficult to say, here are the standardized measures for poverty reduction for programmatic initiatives. We get closer to it, as we'll see in the next module around impact. We might be able to say, here are some universal measures for impact, but in the meantime, contributing to that impact, again, the variation is endless. You've got too many initiatives that are too unique to be able to say, here are these initiatives. So we're going to have to customize. Now let's take a quick look at what we mean by that. Here is a very standard or generic worksheet. They all look something like this, where as you lay out a line of sight, you can talk about outputs, outcomes, and impact, whatever category you have. And people ask, you ask yourself, in order to plan this, what kind of indicator would it be, a hard or soft one? What's your method or data source? Is it program files, surveys, going to Stats Canada? And who's going to do this work and with what kind of resources? Again, lots of variations on this theme, but anytime you do a logic model or theory of change, you probably have to do something like this. If we go back to the Calgary story again, I'm just going to refer to that here was the logic model that they used to create a line of sight. And when they did that, they could easily have put all that stuff on a worksheet. Reduce borrowing costs. What's the indicator, the dollar amount or the percentage difference in cash crunch loans versus payday loans? Where would you go for that? Oh, we could do a file review because this would all be on the files. Number 2, improve credit records. If you really wanted that, you could ask the credit agency rating before and after, and you could do that by checking Equifax, or there's several others. Increase financial management. You could do a participant perception survey, or you could even do a little test if you really wanted to, and do that through an interview or survey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You see the logic of this? Again, the process might be generic, but what you put in these tables must align with your line of sight model and are all based on your local capacity and ability to spend time and resources on this. Now, that's the question. What kind of principles do you have to keep in mind in order to even build a chart like this? Well, let's look at some of them. Oh, before I do, thank you, Dufferin, for letting us take a look at your stuff. And when I was looking at your strategy, what impressed me, and I just took some of the priorities here, these are your priority areas. Some of the actions here, each of these would require their own indicators and methods to track. So we can't offer anything obviously generic there, but we can offer is some principles. And we're going to just talk about 4 principles here again that are extra important for filling out those worksheets. Number 1, what are the priorities? You cannot measure all of these things. Our urge for clarity and data so dramatically exceeds our ability to track it that we have to talk about what's more important than not. So I'm going to go back here to this example here. I think it would be very interesting to do an improved credit record score. And I think the credit agency rating, checking Equifax, might be a really good way of doing that. It's reliable, it's consistent, etc. But it may exceed our effort to do that. We may find that that is not worth chasing. It might be, we assume that's going to happen, but with limited finances and resources, what we really want to do is tackle the reduced borrowing costs, knowing that improved credit record will probably happen on its own, and we don't need to check that. So number 1 is to prioritize measurement. You can't measure it all, so what is mission critical for you to measure? Number 2, if we're doing that, employing mixed methods is also critical. We have that phrase, no narratives without numbers and no numbers without narratives. When you fill out that worksheet, the urge is to put quantitative things there. And of course, we need to have quantitative things, but quantitative stuff does not give us a sense of the quality. So we could be asking for the qualitative assessment of what that impact means. And in fact, if you remember the Niagara example, the Niagara Prosperity Initiative, they actually take testimonials from people and quantify the testimonials. And so you can do both of these things, but it would be really nice if the Niagara Poverty Reduction Initiative would also describe why people think those outcomes are important to them. So what if you were, again, in the case of the cash crunch loans, someone who experienced the loan, the program, and actually got reduced borrowing costs, improved financial management, improved credit record, and then you interviewed them and said, listen, here's the impact of this work. Not only do I feel like I'm better able to access mainstream financial services, but the volume of money I can send home in a remittance. I'm just assuming one as an example of a foreign someone who's working from overseas and having to send money home has increased by $100 a week, and here's what it means for my family. So I don't want to belabor this point because I think it's kind of obvious. When we're talking about indicators and above and beyond prioritizing them, we should use hard and soft indicators to give people a sense of both the depth and the quality of the kinds of outcomes that we're experiencing. Principle number 8 is making informed choices, and this is going to be really big. If you are a geek like me and you wanted to go on the web and Google what are indicators for crime prevention projects, what are indicators for financial empowerment strategies, what are indicators for employment development programs, you spend a bit of time on the web, you will find a lot of different stuff. So as someone putting together an evaluation plan, we have these 3 choices again. Do you want to adopt something that already exists? Oh, they're doing some great stuff in Ottawa, let's just take their indicators and their methods. Do you want to adapt what someone else has? Hey, love what they're doing in Ottawa, like the general thing, but we're going to have to adapt it to Winnipeg. Or 3, do you say, I did my scan, there's interesting stuff out there, but we're going to have to build our own indicators by scratch here. I'm going to give you a real quick vignette of that. Many of you may or may not know Andy Rowe. I think I mentioned this in the first module, actually. Andy Rowe is used to be the head of the Canadian Evaluation Society, and he was doing an evaluation of fisheries in the Atlantic. And he was doing it with the Department of Fisheries, who've got really good quantitative population level data on fish stocks, the cod stocks. But he needed a more granular assessment of that. So they accepted those fish stocks data from the Fisheries of Canada, but he asked local fishermen to say, what is a locally relevant and meaningful indicator for you about how well this program is working and how well the fish stocks are doing? And one of the indicators they gave him was something called catch and release. And catch and release is just a local term that means how long do I have to fish before I catch my limit for personal consumption. And when the fish stocks were high, you might be able to do that in 30 minutes. When fish stocks were low, it might take you 8 or 9 hours to catch your personal limit. And so what they do now is when they come in from the ocean, they stop in at the office and they just report their catch and release numbers, rough estimates about how long it takes for them to catch their stuff. That's a good example. It doesn't mean it has to be exhaustive, but that's locally relevant, that indicator, and they had to build that one from scratch. Evaluation principle number 10, this comes in part and parcel with the using qualitative data. We want to assess value. So when someone says, well, that is an outcome, they've got $200 extra a month in saved costs because they didn't use cash crunch loans, or their neighborhood now has improved, I don't know, access to transit, or whatever your outcomes are. Sometimes people need to understand the value of that. And I've given you 5, we talked about 5 different ways of doing that earlier in the foundations workshop. To what extent have things improved? Well, that's an obvious measure. I've got $200 more in my pocket. To what extent are we making progress on our goals? Oh, our program actually hoped to help them save $500 a year, not $200. Or we thought it was going to be $100, and now it's $2. So benchmarking against the goal, benchmarking against peers or others. Standards, how does our progress compare against, oh, that shouldn't say peers, everyone, that should say against some pre-established standards. And the one that I think is most useful is, how do our diverse stakeholders value the change? And that's where I like having people come in and saying, here is the value of this change to me, from the participant's perspective. That seems to be the most significant or the most useful way of understanding value. So, folks, the measurement challenge is really an important one. We have to do it. The challenge is, we need to prioritize measurement. I'm going to go through this again. We need to prioritize measurement. We can't measure it all. We need to employ mixed methods, hard and soft data together, give a more fulsome picture of what's going on. We have to make informed choices about adopting, adapting, or building our own. and we have to think about at least assessing value, giving meaning and value to whatever programmatic changes we see. That's the challenge number 2. I know some of you want more specific responses than that, but this response we think does capture the universal challenge here, knowing that how you address that challenge depends on your specific case. So we're now going to go into one more quick assessment process. Back to you, Natasha.
All right, thanks, Mark. So again, take a couple of minutes here, and I think we'll do 2 minutes instead of 1 because this is a bit more to take in. So we've told you, we've given you a worksheet actually to be able to build your own indicators and methods based on the programs or projects or initiatives, services that are part of your poverty reduction initiative. We've highlighted a few of the challenges that we're saying, you definitely want to pay attention to as you're building those indicators and methods. Take a couple of minutes to reflect on what are your questions about using that worksheet, about building your own indicators and measurement methods for your initiatives, on applying those principles. Write them down, and we will take them up following the presentation. And just a note, while you're doing that there are a couple of comments already in the chat box, more about connecting outcomes to impacts. So we will start with those questions in the Q&A session. Ten more seconds. All right, you might want to finish writing down any of your questions or your comments. And Mark, why don't you take us into the next challenge?
Right on. Thanks, Natasha. And thanks for the questions, folks. I'm already reading them, and I think we can start with those when we get back into the Q&A session. So the third one is the capacity challenge. And folks, this is the one where I think is really important for all of us to get our head around, because there's a very big difference between us as evaluators of, measuring change when we are managing and running initiatives ourselves. And even if we control the initiatives ourselves, we still got challenges. But what happens when we're trying to do this challenging work, getting a line of sight and getting measurements when we don't control stuff? We're working with a constellation of players who we might influence and support, but we're hardly the boss of them. And they have such a rich range of capacity that they have to be approached on a one-on-one basis. So we really have something called the capacity challenge. And that means we have varying levels of evaluation capacity ourselves to steward the measurement process, and we have varying degrees of influence. So we have to be very clear about how much capacity and influence we have, manage our strategies accordingly, and manage our expectations about what we can get done. So here is a real quick example of 2 different initiatives that both were working on living wage practices. And the first one was one that I was actually involved in between 1996 and the year 2000, where we worked with 3 chambers of commerce and a local college in Waterloo region to create a book called Reducing Poverty in Your Community, 10 Things Your Businesses Can Do to Build Community and Reduce Poverty. And it started off with an income audit and things that companies were doing deliberately to ensure that their employees had a good quality of life, including one of them was improving a living wage. The second story was actually stimulated by the first. It happened in the Quality of Life Challenge in BC's Capital Region, where they were engaging business, and they created something similar. They created a social marketing campaign with the local cable company and the local Better Business Bureau, where they shared good stories of people reducing poverty reduction kind of efforts. And they then asked people to provide feedback about whether or not they were doing something with those stories. Now, these were really interesting because when we ran the evaluation under the first one in Waterloo Region, we actually were using an evaluation tool that was developed in order to assess the poverty reduction impact of 23 different grants that we administered under a large local investment fund. So we controlled what was done, what was evaluated with our own indicators, and we were tracking income, etc. And so we actually had a lot of data on all the nonprofit funded projects, much like the Niagara Poverty Initiative might have as well, because they're the funder. A lot of control, a lot of influence, and we had a lot of capacity at that phase. However, when it came to this project, the businesses, the chambers of commerce and the businesses to whom they distributed this guide, we knew we were getting outcomes there. I actually had a call one day from a company that said, I didn't know what the poverty line was. I just read this book and I shifted 27 different positions, poverty rates, simply because I read this book. I didn't know that I was not paying them a poverty above poverty wage. We heard stories like that all the time, anecdotally. The challenge was we designed our evaluation tool was for nonprofits running projects based on our funding to them, and we could get almost no business to fill out that survey, that standardized survey that we had created before. They were, we had a very loose level of influence with them, and our instrument didn't work, and therefore we missed most of the story of outcomes because of that excellent project by the three chambers of commerce. On the other hand, the Employer Challenge in Victoria, they adopted a process called outcome mapping, which talks about behavior changes of key actors, and they had a very good system for gathering, analyzing, and reporting out on self-reported stories from people who used their framework for improving business practices to reduce poverty. And they sure didn't get everything, and there was still sure some bias in reporting, but they were much more able to regularly provide feedback on what was going on. They really managed their uneven level of influence better than we did in Waterloo. So let's just remind yourselves of principle number 6, that if you're a local roundtable, you don't control anything. You are doing your very best to weave patches of data together, to weave together a coherent story. And sometimes you have a lot of influence. You build and drive the initiatives. Sometimes you have weak influence. You support the intervention from a distance, and all you can do is watch and ask for a little bit of feedback. And sometimes you collaborate in the intervention, you have a little bit more influence. This is not even a perfect spectrum. You could create your own, but you get the general idea here. Let's also remind ourselves that we have limited levels of uneven levels of capacity. Some of you are just 1 or 2 people who are trying to manage the whole entire show. Some of you are much bigger groups that not only have evaluation people on staff, but you might have contractors, and you can do a lot more. We tried to weave these two things together to create a matrix. And everyone, I already would like to change this a little bit, but you get the general idea. When you this is about level of capacity, and this bottom one is about level of influence. So this first one, if you have a lot of capacity and you control your interventions, you could create line of sight frameworks and your own measurement techniques that you plan the work and work the plan. You run it all. You still have those challenges, but you can run the show. But the moment you only have some level of capacity and you're working with others to make it happen, you might be able to create an outcome framework, maybe with domains and some sample indicators. You could encourage the adoption and the adaptation of the framework by your partners, but you can't guarantee it. And you can ask them to please provide you feedback on their work, and then you still have to weave together the story. What if you don't have a lot of capacity and you are barely even supporting the initiative? Really what you're doing is you are asking people to share whatever data they can, and you share impact and outcome stories when partners share them with you. And you may not have the capacity to create a framework, and you certainly don't have a capacity to continue to support and encourage people to use it. So you simply ask what has changed. You interpret those outcomes that they give you in those impact stories, and you try and a coherent story out of them, because you really don't have a hope of getting to level 2 and level 3 capabilities. and interpret their data through your own results framework. Again, there's other ways of doing this, but you get the general idea. These two factors really shape what you can and cannot do. Now let's go back to those examples I gave you. Opportunities 2000, we actually ran, we had our own build and drive kind of framework around poverty reduction and our indicators, and we did a terrific job assessing nonprofit projects, but we really should have come up with a level 2 strategy for those business strategies, or level 2 and 3, or not level 2, sorry, level 2 and 1 strategy. We never really did that, and therefore we missed the story. On the other hand, the quality of life challenge bridged that by using a new framework where they provided an outcome framework and asked for people to provide stories within it, and they got a lot more data than we do. So don't think this is necessarily a thing where in the center bottom left is better. You can actually get pretty good data as well on the top right, but you have a lot more interpretation to do. So that is a biggie. I think it's really hard because most people just assume that there's a very simple way to gather data from everyone in a way that people will just plug into some kind of database their outcomes and give it to you. In practice, we know that our levels of capacity and our zone of influence on our partners really varies a lot, and that has a profound implication about how we even begin to think about gathering and analyzing data. So back to you, Natasha. This is a mission critical thing to get our head around, and so it's worth spending a little bit of time letting people talk about the questions.
All right, so let's take another 2 minutes. It's on the next slide, Hannah, or Mark.
Sorry.
Switching on, that's all right. So we've given you this kind of like a framework or a matrix, understanding that I don't think there is a single collaborative on this call that is 100% solely running poverty reduction programs themselves. So everybody, no matter whether you're running one or two or none, everybody is convening others who are running those programs or projects or services or niche initiatives. So you do have uneven levels of capacity and control over the initiatives. So these strategies are something to keep in mind. What are your questions about this, about how you develop that strategy? How are you going to bring this back to the partners to identify those indicators and methods, develop the logic model or theory of change, that line of sight, and gather all of this data? Write your questions down.
Maybe, Natasha, I'll also just put that diagram up again if you think that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
And this is also in your workbooks too, the diagram. And Jackie and Peel, thanks for joining us. Yes, I can send you today's slides. Ten more seconds. All right, Mark, so while everybody's finishing up writing down their questions, why don't you take us into the final challenge? And this one we said was going to be kind of an optional one for people to take on.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. And this one is one we sort of put in the end. It wasn't part of the original package, but then as I was reading through the plans, I thought, well, this might be useful for some folks. And the reason is, programmatic interventions by themselves have an impact on first a number of people in terms of these intermediate benefits again and the eventual contribution to impact. But those are relatively small. One even might call them micro impacts. So even the cash crunch loans, as terrific as they are, offered by 4 institutions in Calgary, they're probably covering hundreds of people a year, which is not insignificant. Sometimes, however, when you see work, you've created a context for innovation in local poverty reduction efforts. These programmatic initiatives, some of them are deemed worthy of scaling. And when they're scaling and you want to communicate progress on scaling, simply talking about the numbers of people affected and how they're affected actually doesn't give a true sense of the progress. It certainly doesn't give you a sense of progress as a leadership group trying to support scaling. And so we want to throw this in to broaden our conception of what an outcome is in programmatic initiatives trying to reduce poverty. Now, let's just see. Okay. So if we have things that are proven as useful as programmatic interventions and we feel this itch or this urge to scale them, we need to broaden our understanding of what that means and what kind of outcomes we would track and report progress on. Here is a diagram that's adapted from the Nesta Foundation, and there's lots of different diagrams that get to the same point, so don't fixate on this one. But what this one says is often we develop pilot projects that eventually get adopted and possibly scaled. So what happens between 4 and 5 when we're talking about innovating at the ground level? Well, some recent research by 2 groups of Canadians, both of whom happen to live in Vancouver, and the links are provided in your workbook, says that when you're talking about scaling, there's 5 kinds of scaling that we need to pay attention to. So I'm going to talk about each of them now and then just give you a little example of that. Scaling out is where we expand the innovation's original size, or we replicate it to other people. So we have replicators. And what we do there, that's really interesting because we can talk about changes in budgets and partners and networks about people who take it on, but we can also talk about the number of people who have the greater reach. We now have 300 people getting cash crunch loans because the original loans got bigger, or we shifted over to 7 or 8 banks. We could talk about scaling up. When you take an innovation, sometimes you actually have to change the systems in which it is embedded. Policies, regulations, practices, etc. And if we don't do that, we can't actually sustain or mainstream the innovation. So what would we track? We would talk about the number of policy shifts or regulation shifts using stuff like significant instance of policy and systems changes and methodology. That is an outcome. You can actually measure that. You can use hard and soft measures to track that. Sometimes when we scale, not sometimes, all the time, we actually have to assess scaling deep. Have we captured the hearts and minds of people as in a system so that they feel like they own the innovation and are willing to support its sustaining and expansion? And we can easily track that by looking at examples of shared awareness and concrete actions the stakeholders have taken to support the initiative, even unusual suspects. Here's the last 2 that are kind of crazy. The fourth one is scaling scree. Sometimes we need complementary innovations to make the original innovation work. So let's pretend we're dealing with a great housing development project where we're improving access to housing for vulnerable persons in a certain part of the city. That housing project might work. In fact, here's a good example: housing first with wraparound services. So giving someone a house first so they can create stability in order to deal with other vulnerabilities they might be experiencing. That's an innovation, but it may require innovations in the manner in which wraparound services are delivered. Maybe we have to go on site. Maybe we have to think about new types of coordinated case management. This is scaling scree, developing complementary innovations, because the original innovation doesn't work all that well just on its own. And finally, and not less important, is this idea of scaling infrastructure. When we scale something, cash crunch loans, new housing first projects, transportation subsidies, etc., we often need to create the infrastructure to make that happen. It doesn't happen on its own. Someone's got to be focusing on policy change, codifying practices, networking, getting people engaged, and our ability to do that really shapes the ability eventually to scale. And so it's a legitimate outcome. To what extent are local roundtables helping create infrastructure? So above and beyond how many people are affected and how, which is what we talked about in the earlier part of this presentation, and what's the line of sight to that impact. If we get into scaling, here's some new things to consider that are worthy of being called outcomes when we're talking about programmatic initiatives. Here's a real, I won't spend time on this. Actually, maybe I will really quickly. We have a couple minutes. The example of scaling mentoring programs in Alberta. Depending on how you look at it, mentoring can play a big role in poverty reduction initiatives. I was involved in one project where a group was asked to scale their project into other different communities. And so what they did is they focused on scaling out, replication. They went to the project, 5 different communities and said, here's our innovation, would you scale it please? And those 5 other communities said, no, because that works in your community, not mine, or your organization and not mine. So what they had to do was actually come up and saying, look, what part of this innovation is minimum spec? It should work in any context. And what parts should be open to local variation? They did a lot of that questioning and actually came up with a min-spec model that had some core principles and core practices. And then they went back out to the communities and said, hey, would you be willing to try this? We're not going to franchise this. We would like to wholesale it to you and work with you to retail it. For the next 18 months, that original innovator community and the 5 would-be adopters worked together on a new model that was comprised around min specs and open to local variation. And they developed actually a hybrid approach that was not only widely adopted in the 5 different communities, but it created such innovations that the original innovating community adopted some of the things they surfaced through the replication process. So it's a little bit of work there, isn't it? Scaling up, they had to work with policies and procurement policies to make sure the new mentoring programs could be scaled. Scaling deep, they had to work with the innovators and their partners in different communities to get them to really understand and feel the rationale for this new innovative mentoring program. Scaling SCREE, they had to actually create in their organizations a bunch of complementary innovations to allow the poverty reduction effort, the mentoring program to survive. And of course, none of this happened on their own. They created a network to support each other, and it eventually led to a provincial mentoring partnership. So again, this is for those, Natasha, you said this was sort of a niche topic. This isn't necessary for anyone, but if you're getting into scaling any of your programmatic initiatives, it might be worthy of thinking about the scaling framework because it broadens our conception of what is an outcome. Oh, here I gave you that, I just shared this example, and it actually kind of works on a logic model as well, or a theory of change. So the question for you is, what should you be tracking to show the outcomes of your scaling efforts above and beyond the stuff we talked about earlier? And here's a real summary of that. Out, up, deep, SCREE, and infrastructure. So back to you, Natasha. Big idea. Not everyone will find this immediately relevant to their work, but some might. Let's give them another couple minutes, huh?
All right, yeah, take 2 minutes. And we said this one was one of maybe the more optional ones because some people just aren't there yet. I know folks have been struggling with capacity to get through, just what's going on already and what is in the immediate future. So some people are already working on scaling. Some people that's pretty far in the future, maybe a great idea and something that we all want to work towards. But just not within the scope of the next year or even the next 2 years, based on when you're getting your initiatives off the ground. So we've given you some information there about what types of scaling are out there. Mark has thrown out a couple of options for what indicators might be for evaluating impacts or those greater impacts from scaling, and how you might be able to apply that to the theory of change. Write down the questions that you're left with. Anything on theory of change, anything on those indicators, or scaling itself. And Mark, once we come back, I think we have about 5 minutes before some folks start hopping off the line if they're not staying for the extra 30 minutes. Why don't we tackle that one really big question that we had come up in the questions box about connecting impact to outcomes, or outcomes to impact. I'll do the closing announcements, and then we can start addressing some of the other questions that people have been writing down.
Great.
All right, 10 more seconds before we move into what happens next and some of those questions. All right, why don't we move on? And I think from here, it's just summing up what we talked about and we're looking at the workbook.
Sounds great. Well, I'll just, again, confirm, here's the challenge, everyone. We are going to talk about the impact side of stuff, population level change, and impact on poverty reduction in the next section. And so that's important. The most important thing, in fact, the whole set of modules lead up to that. But in order to get there, we had to talk about these intermediate models, awareness building, system change, and programmatic interventions. Programmatic interventions are so diverse that it's very difficult to create something that's universal. It's always done on a case-by-case basis. But when we're doing that as local roundtables, it means us navigating at least these 4 challenges: how to get a line of sight to impact, how to measure things shaped by those 4 principles, knowing that we only have we have uneven levels of influence and capacity, the capacity challenge, and again, the icing, the not cake challenge of scaling. If we have these possibility of scaling, we have to broaden our understanding of what an outcome is. We've got some good questions here, Natasha. And sorry, do you want to go into those now, or do you want us to go to the next slide here?
The next slide, if you go to the next slide, I think it's, just a reminder that all of this is addressed in the workbook. So the workbook will work you through those 4 challenges. And we've provided some matrices and some worksheets, some activities for you. There's no deep dive and shallow dive this time. There are reflection questions in there for everyone, the ones that Mark posed to you in the presentation. If that's enough for you to be able to reflect on some of those things and say, yes, this is going to help us with our plan, that's probably as deep as you need to go. If answering those questions brings up more questions for you, you may need to dive deeper into some of those resources we put in there, fill in some of those worksheets, work on the matrix with your partners. So it's up to you how deep or shallow you go in order to have a plan for measuring your poverty reduction outcomes. There's also an appendix. We heard from lots of people that the examples are really important, so we refer to the appendix if you're looking at any of those tools, matrices, etc. Yes, why don't we dive into those questions? I think if you go to the next slide, it's just the question slide. Yvonne, you were the one who brought up the question first, and then Pamela reiterated it. It looks like, just to clarify, she understands how it works theoretically, but operationalizing it is a bit tougher. Yvonne, did you want to speak at all to the challenge that you're having around connecting programmatic outcomes to poverty reduction impact? If not, maybe Mark, I'll just turn it over to you.
Sure.
It's a big question and one that we went back and forth on a lot.
Yeah. So
sorry, can you hear me there?
Oh, yeah. Yep. Now we can, Yvonne.
My apologies. I was struggling with the unmute button. Yes, I would like to speak more in detail about any solutions for this, but we have experienced Enough for All is a multi-stakeholder poverty reduction initiative that it's a consolidation stage. We're in year 4, and we have the support of many organizations. However, the challenge when we're trying to measure, and I'm sure we share this with many other initiatives, is that when we're trying to look at population indicators, we're very constrained by capacity in the sense of the cost of doing population surveying is very high. So we rely on metrics that are collected by large organizations like StatsCan. So therefore, how close to what we really need to measure are the statistics. It's not for us to decide. So Mark has been providing us with some guidance on how do we live with the imperfection of having population indicators that are sometimes far and they are not timely. So the fact that we used to get LICO every 4 years did not help. So more than anything, a commentary. So I would love to hear what the group has to say about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. Natasha, so Ivan asked about the group to respond to this. Maybe I'll just say one thing before we do that, knowing that this is really the heart of the next module, and we were, Ivan and others, trying to edit what should go in this module versus the next. So maybe what I'm going to do is maybe just give a precursor or an appetizer of what's to come. We're going to argue in the next module that when you're getting programmatic impact, meaning when you got all these programmatic initiatives, to what degree do they contribute to impact, we can get a fairly decent line of sight if you have committed to a working definition of poverty and an impact framework. And we're going to talk about that. And so that is uneven, right? Some groups have used sustainable livelihood, self-sufficiency scales, et cetera. There's lots of things to adopt. But even if a group does excellent work at defining poverty and coming up with a multidimensional framework, it's completely decoupled at the population level because there are, as you know, Ivan, no reasonable ways to provide real-time, multidimensional feedback that lines up with your work, and that's where we're going to have to deal with imperfection. It's just not possible. And in fact, it was working with you, Ivan, and the Calgary group that really forced me over the line on this to come out and make some real strong statements about that. I don't think there's much we can do. And if you don't mind, when we talk about the next module, the impact one, if you would be okay, we could talk about this offline, if we just illustrated how that challenge played out in the Enough for All refresh, because I think it's a great case study. And even if we don't, I'm going to confirm that that's the next module. And programmatic stuff is going to be easier to talk about. Population level stuff, get ready for dealing with utter and complete imperfection about our ability to measure at that level, at least consistently. Natasha, I'm not sure how you want to curate that, but are you there?
Yeah, sorry, there was a loud motorcycle in the background. I think that's a great segue into the next module. It would be hard, we could spend hours going back and forth on this call. Why don't we just jump into the closing announcements? It looks like Yvonne said he's okay leaving the conversation until module 5. We'll open it back up again to see, I know, Yvonne, you put it out to the rest of the group as well to get feedback. So in the next 30 minutes, we'll see if anyone else has thoughts, and then go from there on the workbook and some of the other questions that people had written down. So for those of you who have to hop off now, if you just go to the next slide, Hannah, a couple of quick closing announcements, a reminder that, go back one, yep. A reminder that module 4 is your homework, that workbook. There are some reflection questions and activities in there. Connect again with your manager of cities. You might need to schedule a call if one hasn't already been scheduled. We have recorded this session, so the recording and the resources will be emailed to you in a couple of days. And the next session, module 5, will be July 24th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. It should be in your calendar already, and we will send you 2-week and 1-day reminders in the coming weeks. So thank you everybody for participating. Please stay on the line if you're able to for the next 30 minutes, and we'll take up some of those questions that you had written down. We'll see if anybody had feedback on Yvonne's comment about connecting outcomes to impact, and go a bit deeper on module 4. Just give everybody a second to hop off if they need it. I think, Hannah, if you go to the next slide. I guess I should have said, we have some upcoming webinars. One is on ending chronic homelessness, and the community members from Medicine Hat, Kawartha Lakes, and actually Guelph Wellington have all been showing significant reductions in ending chronic homelessness. So they're going to talk about it, how they're approaching that on our webinar with the Alliance with Marie Morrison of the 20,000 Homes campaign. And we're doing a basic income community of practice. We're starting it with just an introductory webinar so that we're all on the same page. And that's July 8th from 12 to 1 o'clock. The Hamilton Roundtable is helping us lead this series. So Tom Cooper is going to be interviewing Dr. Evelyn Forget of the Manitoba Income Experiment, and Sheila Regier of the Basic Income Canada Network. More information will be sent to you after that. And all right, why don't we get started with some of the questions from last time. I'll open it up to the group right now. Hannah, if you go to the next slide. Yvonne's comment was around moving from outcomes to impact. Mark said, we're going to address this in the next module. It's going to be imperfect. Any other responses to, what that looks like in your own community? Any questions of your own around that?
Actually, Natasha, maybe I'll just say one more thing about that, again, knowing that we're going to talk about it more. And by the way, you'll see in the next module, Natasha and I, back with the team, back and forth a lot on different conceptions of poverty. And we mentioned this in the very first module. Poverty and poverty reduction, there is no universally agreed upon definition or set of metrics. There really isn't. People want it, but people debate this all the time. So there is no there. It's not as if it's hiding under a pillow somewhere. One needs to embrace a working definition and a working set of indicators about what poverty reduction looks like. And so that Dufferin will look different than Niagara, will look different than Calgary, will look different than Surrey. And so the challenge will be in the next module, what is your working definition and your set of metrics? You have an option of not having one or having one. We'll look at those options. And then that creates the context for now, how do you create a line of sight with everything you do to that? And so that's really going to be, that's really important work, because we have to command the framing of what poverty is and poverty reduction is. No one else can do it. There's no answer. We have to agree upon it, and that what that looks like varies from community to community. So the next section will really, we'll go into that more in depth, but it does mean that all of us will have to make choices about what that looks like.
Any other comments or questions on that? Pamela in Halifax, I know you were struggling with that as well.
Yeah, just let me, am I unmuted effectively?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, we have our poverty reduction framework, and we actually have some indicators on which people have tentatively agreed, at least for our next run, our partners and so forth. But I'm doing the impact report now in part, and Natasha, you and I talked about this, and I understand, and the whole notion of, theoretically, when you make a change at an activity-based level, or what we've traditionally called an activity-based level, it affects the whole system, and I get the theory.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get engagement, investment,
yeah,
financial and otherwise, people need more than X number of people came to a workshop or had their income tax assisted with.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm struggling with. And that's where I've just sort of been calling it labeling activities, traditional activities and outputs as outcomes.
Yeah.
And my group and I are both really struggling with that and concerned with putting those type of data out there will not result in a huge investment of time, energy, money, etc. And the other concern is how it, for it to be meaningful for the people with lived experience. So if we're facilitating something and, we say X number of people received whatever service or activity or engaged with it, and someone is still at the level where they need that larger impact, and how meaningful an activity or output-based outcome will be to the people with the lived experience. Did I explain that in any decent way?
Yeah. I think you've raised two important points, and one of them I'm going to return to a slide just to revisit. Boy, sorry, I have to scroll through all of this here.
And Jill in Gray County and Bruce County was just saying that they're struggling with the same thing too.
Okay. So let's just play with some definitional stuff here. I want to agree, and someone had mentioned this earlier, that we are not, here we go. Boy, it's too bad this was at the very beginning. Okay, so we are making a distinction. We should highlight this. Right now, we are going to talk about impact in the next module, impact on poverty reduction. We're talking about programmatic outcomes here. And so one sure could talk about resources, activities, and outputs, but I think everyone agrees with you that that's necessary, but it's insufficient to tell a story about change. It's not, people want it, but they want more than that. So the challenge is, how do we talk about the intermediate changes generated by those interventions, resources, activities, and outputs? And what this says is that will vary from case to case. I'm going to go down one more here. In the case of these cash crunch loans, the impact is, hey, we ran this project and we've got evidence of reduced borrowing costs. Here's the amount of average savings. We've improved credit records and we've increased financial management. And we are telling you that here's the line of sight. This contributes to improvements in financial assets, which is one part of the poverty puzzle. Now, you'll notice there that I'm talking about sustainable livelihoods. Here's where this group has a benefit. They already have a framework from which to work from. They have a container in which to tell an impact story. Now, when it comes to how much data and time and effort do we have to produce that, we'll get into that in the next module, but I do think there's some exciting things here. For example, you might say, well, we know that we've got 300 people being involved in this. Let's actually just do a couple of vignettes and saying, here's Sarah or Sanjay or Larry. And let's do a little story about how they were affected. Do a little thing about reduced borrowing costs, average amounts of savings. Let them talk about what it was that they found most valuable. They've assessed the value for themselves. How does that contribute to poverty reduction? You could say, look, we don't have the evaluation budget to follow all 300 people, but this is the kind of impact we can expect from doing these kinds of initiatives, right? That you're acknowledging you have limited resources. That's one way of doing it. I'm going to give you one more. What if someone says, actually, here's a riddle for everyone. Do we need to use a randomized controlled trial to show that jumping out of an airplane with a parachute improves your chances of survival? That's a joke. It's not a very good one. Thanks for not laughing. But sometimes we don't have to reprove what has already been proven. So here's an example of that in a program that was evaluated for poverty reduction on early childhood development. They were trying to use cradle to career framing of, if you help a kid from 0 to 18 make developmental milestones in kindergarten, grade 3, grade 6, grade 9 and 12, etc., they will have a better trajectory of avoiding poverty than if they do. And the issue that programmatic intervention was a breakfast program. I'm sure everyone understands what breakfast programs are supposed to do. The research shows that if a kid goes to school hungry, they actually don't learn well. And if they don't learn well, they're not going to make developmental milestones in elementary school. And if they don't make those developmental milestones, their likelihood of graduating with any kind of decent grades and confidence is quite low. So you could show a line of sight and you could say, hey, here's the number of kids that are receiving a breakfast program, 300, let's just use that. And here's how well those outcomes are happening. By the way, don't ask me to keep reproving the link between breakfast programs and high school graduation rates. We already know that it contributes to that, but I'm not going to track that for you. That's not a very good use of evaluation resources. So this is you're raising a really good point that we're talking about outcomes. And when we try and talk about a line of sights between outcomes and impact, we're going to have to commit to some kind of impact framework. That's the next module. But we're doing our bloody best to frame outcomes in a compelling way, and we do the best we can with the resources we have. And that is always done on a case-by-case basis. It's very difficult, but it's actually quite exciting too, to see how can we tell a decent outcome story based on the evidence we have.
Is that helpful, Pamela? Did that kind of help to answer the challenge that you're having?
Yeah, it does. I think where it comes out for me the most is with, I was thinking more, as I was listening to Mark, I was thinking about the last module about nudging system change. So it's more about the stuff within the boundaries and changing the attitudes of the system or getting someone to agree to change a policy. It was more along that zone.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's definitely, I understand completely making the link and the theory of change and it's just with the systems change part more so.
Yeah,
I agree. Initiatives, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here's the irony of this module. This one in some ways was more easy for people to handle, including ourselves. We do something, and does someone get out of? Does it help them reduce their level of poverty or improve the chances that they won't experience it? And you think that would be straightforward until you actually get into the weeds like we are now. Ironically, some of that systems change stuff might be a little bit easier. The challenge is, and we'll see this in the last module, that when we try to understand impact, we're going to have to say, here are all the intermediate outcomes we generated, and here is their cumulative contribution to different kinds of impact, programmatic, targeted, and systemic. And some of these questions, I think, will be a little bit clear in the last module, even though we may not be fully satisfied with our ability to answer them.
Sounds like maybe communicating all of this is going to get much more complex as well. I'm trying to envision are those beautiful shiny one-page sheets that have, the impact, and that's what people who are giving you money want. And with all the corollaries and footnotes, that I'm just sort of envisioning it.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's going to be challenging. We might find something between a one-pager and a PhD. And by the way, this is where we're fighting framing. People, when they don't know what's going on, they look for some kind of bottom line quantitative indicator because it's too chaotic for them. We have a bit of civic literacy building in our communication strategy, module 6, and we aren't a reductionist. This is not a business measurement is way easier than our work. That's not even close. It's the level of complexity is nothing in business compared to this because they have a reductionist indicator they can use and they can slice it and dice it using 7 different kinds of ratios. We have a multidimensional challenge that people don't agree on what the outcome is, and we have very uneven levels to get feedback. So it's really like when a business person asked me how to do this, I said it's like comparing apples and motorbikes, not even apples and oranges. They're just completely different enterprises. But we feel the proper stress to get this right in the next module and the last one.
I think this is a great conversation. I'm going to ask if we can put a pin in it for now because we'll continue to address it in the next module. I do want to recognize that there are a couple of questions that are coming in. Yep. So let's see if we can address some of these as quick as possible because we have about 10 minutes left. So Julian, Elaine, and Dufferin were asking, how do you decide what partners you should ask for data? Is this a 2-part process? Should you ask all the partners what data they collect and then ask them if they can share what's useful to you?
Oh, it's a good question. Yeah, you know what? And it's one where I don't even have a strong response unless I was in your situation, Julian, Elaine, just to feel what it was like. I have to admit, I think even the best measurement systems from local roundtables always go through generations of adaptation. So version 1, version 2, and version 3. This happened with Vibrant Communities Canada from 2001 to 11. We went through 3 different iterations of what an outcome was and how to measure it. We started with income-based, then we went to 5 key assets, and then we went to sustainable livelihoods. And so I'd have an urge simply to find out what people were doing, and then, like, the level 1 stuff, look at what people are doing and try and interpret it and create coherency out of it. I try to do that first, and then figure out, see if I could actually add more structure to it by introducing a framework to say, hey, we've got 7 partners here who gave us their stuff. We're thinking there's a common theme here. Let's let's see if we can introduce it. So I would treat it very developmental and adaptive like. Because I think part of the challenge is it depends on how your partners want to work with you and how you want to work with your partners. You can only figure that out by thinking with your hands, by doing it.
Moving on to the next question, we also had one from Jill in Grey Bruce, and she actually had to hop off, but Kathy, I see that you're still on the line, so maybe you can bring some of this information back to her. Her question was about when we were talking about valuing. Their question was, how do you decide which peers you should benchmark yourself against?
Thank you. That was a very good question. And I should have done a better job of introducing that. I'm not suggesting you use any of those frameworks. Those are simply ways that people have done it. And maybe what we could do is talk about the pros and cons of each of those if we upgrade the workbook. But I agree, benchmarking is very difficult. If I'm stuck in a corner and someone says, how do you value this? My response is level 1, is it better than it was? Number 1. And number 2, get stakeholder perceptions to assess value. The fifth kind, everything in the middle, benchmarking, goal attainment, and all that kind of, meeting some kind of standard, I think it's too difficult to do for the average project. But in the field of evaluation, those are 5 different ways of assessing value. The first one and the fifth one seem to be the most relevant for me for poverty reduction. So it's a very good question, and we should have done a better job of explaining it.
And then her second question, and I think this is a really good one. How do they deal, like within the task force or the roundtable, how do you deal with uneven levels of capacity influence? Some projects have sufficient capacity and others don't. So it's really inconsistent even across how they're working at that roundtable, or the projects that we're working with at the roundtable.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I don't think that's unusual. I think almost everyone has a patchwork of capacities and influence in a change effort. That's why that one principle, Natasha, that we talked about you weave together whatever you can from all those different sources and try and create a coherent outcome and impact story. That there is no way of dealing with it except to deal with it. You got lots of information in some and not as much in others, and that's why I shared that example of Opportunities 2000 and our campaign for engaging businesses. We weren't responsive. We didn't deal with that, and we only used the one set of instruments. We didn't even consider that outer level of just grabbing stories and making coherence out of them. And then we missed an entire story. Our final evaluation missed the impact literally on hundreds and hundreds of lives because we were inflexible. We need the ability to draw data from all of those situations and create a coherent story out of it. It's just how you do that depends, but the why of doing it is so obvious to me anyways, or else we're missing most of the story.
Hi there, it's Kathy. So I work with Jill, and Jill and Carolyn are really the knowledge champions in our group. There's 3 of us. Yep. And what I'm finding is I'm sort of in a learning role, which is great. I'm really enjoying it. I will say that not having more of the I don't know, I wouldn't call it buy-in, but not having as much participation from other agencies or organizations that are part of the Poverty Task Force has made our role much more difficult. Mm-hmm. As we have to wait till meetings happen to get everyone together to give sort of updates on what's happening on our end with this project.
Yeah.
And now what we've been asked to do in the fall, so basically everything's on hold until September because there's so many people that sit at the table, and with vacations and all that sort of thing, we're finding it very difficult to get together.
Yeah.
So what we've been asked to do is provide like a half-day training session. Yeah. I'm thinking, why didn't people just join in with this? Because right. I guess I'm just venting. Yeah. Because I'm thinking, wow, so we're going to come up with some sort of training session, I guess. I'm not sure what that's going to look like yet. We haven't really talked too much about it. We've just been asked to do it, and I'm sure we will agree and move forward with it in some way, shape, or form. But just to, so it's going to be even some time before we can get the information, but I guess whenever we get it is better than not getting it at all.
And you're speaking specifically about wanting to see the impact stuff sooner. Is that right?
Well, I just getting this project off the ground and what the Poverty Task Force is really looking for, right? Like I just feel like we're at the very beginning stages of this. Like we have asked our partners what statistics they track, and typically a lot of organizations and the corporations aren't tracking, certain statistics. They're so as an example, we were wondering if they track how many Indigenous children might be living below the poverty line. Well, they're using the general Canadian stats. Do you know what I mean? Again, I'm not very knowledgeable about all this. I'm actually in the childcare field, so I'm new to a lot of this stuff. So, but so I guess I'm now I don't even know where I was going with all that.
But this was, Natasha and I knew this, whether to introduce some of the stuff in Module 5 now or wait till Module 5.
Okay.
We'll really get into it. And part of it is, I think, our challenge is, can we increase as a group together our literacy about what needs to be done and what is possible in this work. Okay. So there is a moment where because we'll say this, people want to measure anything that moves.
Okay.
And the moment it gets measured, people disagree about how it was measured and should it have been measured. It's just almost predictable how these things go. And we could be tracking there's so much stuff to track. The question will be, how do we track it in a way that's coherent and we actually use it? And at a population level, we have these choices all the way from it's too complex, let's actually follow one very primitive measure as a proxy, income.
Okay.
We're going to make the case for that, actually, and some of you will like it, some of you won't. And the other one that says it's not remotely helpful, we need it to be multidimensional, but look at the effort it's going to require to actually do that.
And I just want to say, I think that a lot of the people sitting at the table they're very interested and they want to be part of it, but everyone is so busy with their own portfolios that it's hard to carve out time, right? So I'm not saying that people aren't interested. I just think
absolutely.
Yeah. So it's
and we want to make it coherent. You want to create the conditions so whatever precious time they give you is not only valued, but probably, I'm guessing here for you, that you want to do it in a way that they're hungry for the next meeting, not dreading it.
Yeah, of course.
It's unbelievably difficult to do, I know. Yeah, so we're just trying to make the navigation journey easier here, but it doesn't mean that the navigation journey will be easy.
No.
The next module, I think, is going to be a big one, Natasha.
Okay, well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We have 1 minute left. Does anybody have a final question, either about the workbook or a question that they had written down as we were going earlier today? Pamela, I do see your comment in the comment box, and there are resources available on choosing the best people or the right people for the roundtable, so I can send that to you offline.
Thank you, Natasha. Much appreciated.
Okay, I don't hear any more questions, so it could be that they were answered or you're saving them up for your manager of cities meetings, and they might be answered in the FAQ if one of us can't answer them. So thank you, everybody, for staying on the line with us, for asking your questions and providing some helpful feedback. It's not always easy sharing.